find a pen and fill the paper with the message that it wants to send.
Hello, welcome to the Aviatrix Book Review. I'm Liz Booker, and welcome to March, when we celebrate Women's History Month, International Women's Day on March 8th, which is why I'm wearing my purple today, and which also marks the beginning of Worldwide Women of Aviation Week, as the anniversary of the first female licensed pilot, Raymond de la Roche, on March 8th, 1910. In February, the Aviatrix Book Club discussed the Happy Bottom Riding Club about Pancho Barnes, one of the original 99s, aviation's early pioneering women, led by their first president, Amelia Earhart. This month, I'm talking with a few authors whose work celebrates the women who flew for their countries during World War II. And I'm thrilled to announce that the Aviatrix Book Review website is now live. There you'll find all the books we're talking about today, along with hundreds of other books featuring women in aviation history, as well as contemporary stories in a range of genres for all ages. I'll also be posting short pieces on our blog on the website all this month featuring various women in aviation history written by several of our authors, including my guest today. She is the author of 14 novels, which have earned a long list of literary awards. She was a writer of Arthurian legend first, but after being introduced to aviation through her husband and earning her private pilot's license, her focus shifted to more modern historical fiction, much of which features women pilots and is set in World War II. These books bring that period of history to life, educating us about our women pioneers in aviation through adventure-filled stories, all of which are based on her meticulous research of real people and real events. She is perhaps best known for her young adult novel, Codename Verity, which hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list in March of 2020. But that book is just one of several works that she's written since then that feature the women who flew for the British Air Transport Auxiliary, the Russian Night Witches, the German Luftwaffe as test pilots, and she has even written a book about a couple of 1920s aerobatic performers and wing walkers. In honor of Women's History Month, I invited her to share this rich history and her work with us. You can find her at her website, elizabethwein.com. Okay, Elizabeth, so let's shift in to talking a little more deeply about writing. In the first half of our interview, you talked a lot about the research that you do and have done, and then you shared kind of some of the summaries of the stories and the characters that you've written about. How do you craft your stories? Is it like, what comes first? Does the story come first and then you kind of try to wedge in some period of history, or do you find about that period of, or that group of women flying and then create a story around it? And where does the fact stop and the fiction start?
I think really the characters come first. So, and they come first not in a void. They come first they arrive in their time. So, this character, the character who turned into the Verity character in Codename Verity, there she was in a Gestapo prison, and it was sort of then up to me to tell her story. It works much more like that than, oh, this time looks interesting. It works differently. This is the thing. There's no formula. It works differently for every novel. So with Black Dove, White Raven, which I think was the last one I was talking about, which is so off the wall compared to everything else I've done, it was really the character of the mother is the biggest character in this story, which is awkward for a YA novel. But she was the one who just kind of like leapt out at me and she was partly based on my own mother, so maybe that's partly why, but she is of her time. Coming up with her backstory was sort of easy because I knew that she was going to be a barnstormer, and I knew that she was going to meet this Italian guy in World War I because she was a nurse, because of nobody's ever done that before. and because I really wish I was Hemingway. so the story grew around that. It grows around the characters. And likewise, with Rose Under Fire, I knew that I was going to have this ATA pilot who was going to end up in the concentration camp at Ravensbrück, and then the character. And my books are like in my files. Each one is called Rose's book, Stella's book. I'm trying to think of other names of other characters, and they're all going out
Actually,
of my head. Julie's book.
I only have two underway right now, and that's what I named them too. I named them the
Yeah.
character's name. That's
Yeah,
probably a
yeah.
good sign. I'm on the right
So
track.
yeah, so the characters, for me, the characters really come first, and the plot kind of like builds around them. And the historical stuff is really just the time in which they're set. With one of the shorter books that I wrote for Barrington Stoke, so I should explain a little bit about Barrington Stoke. They're a Scottish company. They're based in Edinburgh, and they have made a name for themselves writing, oh, this lovely sticker here, super readable books for young readers of all ages. So they have picture books, and they have middle grade books, and they go on into young adult. And they approached me and asked me if I would write. It's sort of supposed to be like, they wanted a kind of Codename Verity light. And I had this idea about, which was kind of based on, I feel like I should give you a major spoiler for this one. Can you live with it?
I think our writers can live with a spoiler. They okay,
I've
hey
grown
everybody,
up
there's gonna be a
enough to be able
spoiler.
to deal with it.
She's holding up, by the way, for those
Yeah.
that are listening, she's holding up her book Firebird right now.
Yes. Okay, so spoiler, the idea for this book was that Anastasia Romanoff, the youngest of the murdered Tsar princesses, survives and becomes a pilot. Okay, so that was like, I had this like brainwave while I was sitting there watching the Fox Anastasia cartoon, and I was like, oh, this would be a great story. And I told them when they, right, so if you're back in the room listening now, I told my great idea to the people at Barrington Stoke, and they said, oh yeah, that's exactly what we want. It's going to be a story about the women who flew in the Soviet Union in World War II. And so I wrote that for them. And this won a prize too. It's called the Quills Award for Historical Fiction, which was nice, because it was the first book that I published with them. And they said, can you write us another book? And I said, yeah, sure. And I pitched them some Scottish fantasy folklore story. And they were like, no. we want more lady pilots.
What did they call that in acting?
Typecast.
Typecast. Now you're typecast.
Yes. So I came up with a pitch for what became this book, which is White Eagles, and is based on the invasion of Poland. And I actually took my inspiration for this book from a Polish woman named Anna Leska, who I knew about from having done lots of other research on the ATA, who had stolen a plane after the Nazi invasion of Poland and flown it to safety, and eventually made her way to England and joined the ATA. So that is Anna Leska's story. It's not really the story of White Eagles, but it was like the seed for it. So I wrote that for them. And then after I'd written these two books, and kind of while I was working on White Eagles, I was going, okay, so we've had the Germans invading Russia, and now we've had the Russians invading Poland, as well as the Germans. I feel like I need to write a book about a German person. And that was how The Last Hawk came about. Again, it was partly the reason I got started on these is from the craft point of view of how they come into being. And it really does start with the character. So, for Firebird, it started with that Anastasia character. And for White Eagles, it started with the Anna Leska character. And for the last talk, although the viewpoint character is not Hannah Reich, it really started with Hannah Reich and her exploits that made me craft this story. So the character comes first, and their setting, follows them. And then, of course, I have to go and I have to research the setting. It was not too difficult for Firebird because I wrote that while I was working on A Thousand Sisters, the nonfiction.
Yeah,
the nonfiction, which I also have a copy of, and I don't think I've waved it at you. But I was working on that, so I had all the research there in my head at my fingertips, and it wasn't too difficult to do. And also because I'd done that research, I felt like I was much more in the mindset. I had said earlier that I didn't feel I was culturally able to write fiction from a Russian point of view. I felt much more equipped to do it by the time I got around to writing this book. And also because it's novella length, it's so much shorter than a novel that you don't really have time to get as deeply involved in the background as you would in a novel. So
yeah,
that helped too, I think.
that makes sense. First of all, referring back to something you said earlier, I'm glad you're not Hemingway. I've read plenty of his work, and I like yours better, actually. Too much machismo there for me. And you have mentioned several times that you now are cast type into this role, but you still are drawn to your fantasy because you keep trying to pitch them. Like, how do you deal with that tension? And what, are you going to write some fantasy because that's what you like to do, or what's your plan?
I don't know. Eventually, maybe I will. I have an idea in my head for. I tend to write fantasy as short stories. I still have my finger in that original fantasy pie. Oh dear me, what a metaphor. And being able to do that Star Wars book was also it was a lovely self-indulgence. It's like, oh wow, I get to do some actual world building here, and it was really really fun. And I was like, oh yeah, I used to write science fiction when I was a teenager.
That's awesome.
So I mean, definitely that's there. The sort of the seed for something that I'm working on is not really fantasy. It's more of a kind of like intertwining of time. I don't know if you're aware of the novels of Rumer Godden, but she has a good example is A Fugue in Time, it's called. And it all takes place in this house in London. And it takes place over 100 years, but not linear time or not chronological time. So she goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and not just switching from one time period to another, but like it's almost like it all exists at the same time. Like everything that has ever happened in that house is still happening in that house. And I really liked the way she did that. I think it's a fantastic book. And I would kind of like to do something like that. So have some character, start out, but with flight, still talking about flight. So that's something that's kind of playing around in my head, how I'm going to structure this thing and what the connection between the characters is going to be, the earlier characters, the later characters.
Oh, that sounds great. That sounds fascinating. What does your publishing journey look like? You started off with the Arthurian legend, and then you wrote Codename Verity was your first book featuring a woman in aviation. And so, did you have an agent? Did you have an agent at all already? And then did that agent stay with you when you sort of shifted genre? How did that all look for you?
Yes, I had an agent already. I've had two agents in my literary life, and the first one I picked up. It's like it's like your first boyfriend or girlfriend. It's like
I
it didn't work.
I have heard it described
I picked up at a con. That is true. and we went out for a couple of years, and nothing happened. there was no spark. I mean, it sounds so facetious, but it's actually true. I didn't write anything. I gave her nothing to sell, and she really didn't do anything to promote me, and we parted very amicably before I had written my second novel. And so, how I ended up with my agent now, who is Ginger Clark, who is at Curtis Brown in New York, is she was working as an assistant to Marilee Heifetz, who's grande dame of agents, and at Writer's House. And I had written this draft for my second novel, and I had then written this like sizzling hot, inspired, bizarre thing, which turned into my third novel, which is called The Sunbird. And this is all in this Arthurian, loosely Arthurian trilogy. And so I had essentially three novels. One of them was published 10 years earlier. One of them really needed a lot of work. And one of them was beautiful and perfect, but was the third in the series. And through the work that I've been doing volunteer work for the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators here in the UK, and through them, I became friends with Robin Mckinley, who is a fantasy writer, who she won the Newbery Award when she was really super young in 1985 for, I think, her first novel. Maybe it wasn't her first novel, it was, she was very, very young at the time. And she said, she read my first novel and she said, you need an editor. And she introduced me to Sharon November, who did indeed eventually become my editor. Sharon read all this stuff, these unpublished books and the published one, and she loved them. And she said, we would like to buy this. You need to think about how you want to sell these books. Do you want to rewrite the second one? Do you want to rewrite the third one, so that the beautiful and perfect one, so that it stands on its own, or do you want them, to stay together as a trilogy? And in the meantime, Robin, who I think Marilee Heifetz was her agent as well, she said, now you need an agent. And she introduced me, probably by email, to Ginger, who was like 24. And so I came to Ginger, who was very young, who was working as an assistant, who had not sold a book on her own yet, with these three books that already had a potential buyer.
Yeah, that's great.
And so it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And we have been through some ups and downs. So Ginger has sold all my books. Except for the Winter Prince the first time round. But, she's been involved in everything I've ever published. She moved from Writer's House to Curtis Brown in, it was like 2005, something like that. And I went with her, even though it meant orphaning all my previously published books. Okay.
Wow. So what does that mean for you?
Well, so that meant, at the time, it meant that the rights to all my earlier books were with Writer's House, but Ginger wouldn't be there to champion them anymore.
Understood.
Okay. And it was a really, really tough decision to make at the time. And this, of course, was before I'd written anything as good as or as saleable as Codename Parody. So I had no idea that
what would happen,
anything was going to come of it.
So I have a question. So did you have the option in that moment to either take on another agent within that publisher?
I could have taken on another agent in that publishing house.
Move with your agent.
I could have done anything. I could have gone to look for another agent on my own. I could have taken on another agent. They would have paired me up with somebody.
Yeah.
In that publishing house, or I could stay with Ginger, which is what I did.
Yeah.
So we've had other ups and downs too, and she's really, really proved her weight in gold as far as representing me is concerned. She has really fought my corner under a number of difficult circumstances. So I have had the same agent since, I would say, I think it's 2001. It's like our 20th anniversary now.
Wow. That's amazing.
I got to point that out to her. I mean, A Thousand Sisters is dedicated to her. And a lot of the jobs that I end up getting, I get because of her. So
she's bringing you work now.
She's bringing me work. She is really getting the best deals for me that she possibly can. She specializes in foreign rights. So she's also managed to bring me a lot of foreign deals. Codename Verity is she has one of her bugbears is that she doesn't like to sell all rights to a title to one publisher, because you can really get more money for your client if you sell them as separate packages. So she does that a lot, and traditionally my audiobooks have all been published by a separate publisher. I have, for every one of these novels, I have a separate publisher in the UK, in the US, and in Canada. The takeaway from this is I find an agent invaluable, any agent, just to deal with the financial side of things, but also to act as a buffer when you have difficulties with the publisher. Ginger will always step in, and I won't have to deal with that. And some agents are also willing to work with you on your novel, which she has never done, but that's because I've never asked her to, I think. So
yeah, I mean, you started that relationship off already with an editor of your own, so that's interesting. Really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Tell me a little bit about Codename Verity. You published it, when was it?
2012.
2012?
Yeah.
And then you hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list in 2020.
Yeah.
What?
So
how did that work?
How that happened, there is a catch. It had actually hit the New York Times bestseller list in, I think it was just at the end of 2012. And that was because it got a recommendation on NPR right before Christmas. And so, people heard this book being recommended and they went out and started buying it. And then in January, and then it dropped off. It was like number 14. It didn't make the print edition. And then it dropped off again. And then it was shortlisted for the Prince Award, which is the American Library Association, YALSA, the Youth Services branch of the American Library Association. It's their award for young adult fiction, or I guess they could have awarded it to nonfiction as well, but it's the young adult award. And it then hopped back onto the list at, I think, number 10, which meant that it was in the print edition. So it was kind of on and off. And anyway, it gave me enough of clout to be able to put New York Times bestselling author in the shout line of all my books. But what happened in March of last year was that it had been on a Barnes and Noble promotion where you could buy in February. So for the whole month of February, you could buy a coffee and you could buy Codename Verity for $5 along with your coffee. And this promotion,
wow,
boosted it to #1 on the it was the YA list, but it's not new books, so it's just YA in general, and it's a list that comes out monthly.
What fortunate timing!
I know.
Nobody was buying coffee after March.
No, that's right. That's
crazy.
I have a friend whose book was in that same promotion the following month, and although her book did pop onto the bestseller list, it wasn't at #1. So it was a very, very visual representation of like how few people were going into Barnes and Noble at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, congratulations. That's
Thank
amazing.
you.
How has that book affected your writing life?
I mean, that book changed my life. Like in every way, that book changed my life. Um, Part of the problem with it is that you get there was a review of my latest book, um, sorry, my latest like full length novel, which was published last year and during lockdown, and is called The Enigma Game, and is not about a woman pilot. It's about a Royal Air Force squadron. It has got women in it, but the pilots are all male. And I had this review turn up which said, it's just been downhill since Codename Verity, and this book proves it. And it's kind of like, it's you're never gonna come up to that.
I know.
It's like the holy grail of writing.
Elizabeth Gilbert talks about that in Big Magic, about, Eat, Pray, Love was like her big seller. But so then everybody compares everything that you write after that to that one book. And it's like, well,
yeah,
I couldn't predict that was going to happen.
Everything gets compared to it, and nothing is ever as good. And I mean, I know that nothing has ever been as good. And it's not even that I sort of look at it and go, oh, it's not as good as Codename Verity. It's because I wrote Codename Verity in this like blinding white fire of inspiration. The Sunbird and Codename Verity were the only books that I had just been like, okay, I have to write this or I'm going to explode.
Really?
Yeah. And there is something very, very mystical about it. There really is. And people say, well, how did you come up with the plot for Codename Verity? It's so twisty and so complicated. I was like, I didn't. I literally didn't. I'd be writing along and I go, oh my God, that's what she's doing, Oh my God, she's working for them. And like, I didn't plan it that way. It just happened. I mean, obviously I did it. I did the work. I sat there and wrote it. I did the research, but
you didn't have a plot outline that
described everything. I knew where it was going. I knew where it was going. I had an aha moment before I started writing where I knew that it was going to be told as this confession, that it was going to be told in two parts, that like each part was going to tell the story of the other part. And I knew what the big climax was going to be. And that's all I knew going into it. I didn't know what anybody's character was like. I kind of knew what their situation was. I didn't know really what their background was. I didn't know what Verity's assignment was. I didn't know what her role was within the Special Operations Executive. I didn't know what Anna Engel's role was. I mean, there's just like so much I didn't know. And I didn't find it out until you find it out in the book, which is, I think, partly why it works.
How long did it take you to write the first draft?
7 months. It was like,
that's awesome.
I was on fire.
That's so awesome. And then how did revision look for that?
It didn't need revising.
Oh, listen to you. Okay.
The one thing that we changed, okay, the one thing that we ended up changing was that there's a character in it who is an American who is working as a radio announcer in Berlin. So she's working for the Nazis, and she's doing this propaganda work trying to discourage Americans who are in the European theater of war. And she was originally a newspaper reporter. She was actually based on a real life character whose name is Virginia Hall, who has become like really a hot topic right now. There are like 3 different books and a television series or something about her this year. But Virginia Hall was an American who was working for the Special Operations Executive. And so this character was based on her. And the publisher had a researcher at the Imperial War Museum read the manuscript, and he said, nah, all the newspaper reporters had been sent away with the fall of Vichy France. And here is a suggestion for how you can fix this character, and recommended a book about these American women who'd been working for German propaganda machine. So that was like the one thing that I changed in that book. But
That's great.
the rest of it, it was like cosmetic editing. That was it.
Fabulous.
Now, that's not the case for anything I've written since then.
Thank you for being real.
No, it doesn't all spring fully formed from my head like Athena.
You had a lot of writing before too to be ready to kind of.
Yeah, the last 3 books that I've written have all, they've been through 3 major drafts, rewrites involving changing the point of view, changing the voice. One went from having 1 narrator to having 3 narrators. So it's everyone is different, but there is a lot of work usually. And Codename Verity is just like, where did that come from?
Special magic from the ether. Yeah. That's great.
But the other thing I would say is really this is not aimed at you, but it's aimed at somebody who maybe needs to hear it. Open yourself up to editorial advice. Being able to take on board the fact that like you haven't written this beautiful and perfect thing is really, really key to being able to work with a publisher. And it's hard, because especially when you're like, okay, it's finished now. I really love it. I've put my soul into this. And somebody reads it and they come back to you and they're like, this really doesn't work, especially the first 85 pages.
Yeah, that is something that I have been dealing with myself. I have the novel that inspired me to want to go get a Master of Fine Arts in Writing. And I worked on it the whole time that I was there. And then I had to take a 2-year break for work things. And then when I finally retired, I decided I was going to write and I was going to start a new novel because I was so emotionally attached to that one. I was not ready to take the kind of feedback that really will make it much better. I know it will. I know intellectually that it will. But I needed practice by playing. And so the novel that I chose to take on, as my first one, at least as to write, I don't know if it's the first one I want to actually try and find an agent for, but I want to play. And, I have 2 great writing partners who give me that kind of feedback and tell me when it's not working. And so then I'm not emotionally attached to it. I'm like, okay, well, let me try this. Yeah. So that's very good advice and good to know. Both that something magical can happen like your inspiration, but that also you are human and have to work at it still.
Yeah, and I mean, like everybody else, I'm waiting for that to happen again. And the thing is, I feel like, okay, well, if it never happens again, I got Codename Verity out of it, So,
and your other work is valuable and important and making an impact as well. So, and because you wrote that. Yeah. It's accessible to people, and this history is accessible to people. So I'm very grateful for that too. So we just did lots of writerly advice. Did you have any other advice for writers or topics that you wanted to cover?
This is starting to feel cheesy now when I give it because I've given it so often. But this is what I tell school groups: write about something that you love, write about something that you're passionate about, and because we get told so often, particularly if you're very young, you get told, write about what you know. And I think it really should be write about what you love. That, I think, gives the writing itself that spark that makes other people want to read it. They're not going to be interested in it if you're not interested in it. So write about something you're passionate about. And the other thing, I mean, this may be super obvious, but join a writing group. Get a writing buddy. If you don't feel like sharing, and I'm not a sharer, I don't like sharing my what I'm working on until I feel like it's in really, really good shape. And at that point, all I want is for you to say to me, yeah, I love it. I want you to tell me what needs to be done to it. But if you have somebody who is just sitting on the other side of the table from you, or in this day and age where you can't like go meet in a cafe, even if you're not actually in contact, if you both know you're working at the same time, right? This is our time to write, and when we're done, let's have a cup of tea or something over Zoom or whatever. Having that other person there really helps kind of push you on and make you sit down and get the work done. And for some people, being in a writing group and sharing your work is really, really a helpful thing. And more, I see that being acknowledged, in author's notes. Thank you so much to my writing group. This manuscript would never have turned into a real book if it hadn't been for the wonderful suggestions by the people who supported me through this. And the other thing is join a writing society. Join, depending on what the genre for your book is. Join the Science Fiction Writers of America, the Mystery Writers of America, the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, all of which I am members of, and go to the events that they put on, or which are now all available online anyway. So they're actually easier to go to, although, there are pros and cons for the fact that you're not actually there meeting people.
Yeah, I mean,
but
both have their pros and cons,
yeah,
like you said. And they'll be back in person. They'll be back in person again. So
yeah, and get involved in these societies and their events, because they're fantastic ways to meet other writers, to meet professionals in the industry, to meet agents, to meet editors, and to have help people kind of like point you to the ones that are going to most benefit you. There's really nothing like personal interaction to point you to the right person. And I think you, Liz, would probably add, take a course.
I was waiting for you to finish to give a plug for those young adult and children's writers. If you want more and more structure and just more all around, the Vermont College of Fine Arts, Writing for Children and Young
absolutely.
Adults program.
Vermont College of Fine Arts. There you go.
Thank you. Elizabeth, this has been really special. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights. I'm really grateful to know you through this group of women in aviation writers, and then also have the special combination of you being the writer that you are for young adults and the success that you've had. So thank you for sharing your time with me.
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you for the amount of time that you have been putting into making this wealth of interaction with other writers available to us, because it's just a gargantuan effort you've been putting into it. And
I'm giving you my
really
full attention for the moment as we get this thing built. But as I do this with you, I'm more and more inspired to get back to my writing. So we're going to get this to a manageable workload. Once I master all the technical stuff and we get some content built, then I can get back to my writing too.
Good.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for listening. Please check back later this month when I'll be interviewing Sarah Byrne Rickman, who is the author of almost a dozen nonfiction biographies featuring the women air service pilots from World War II, as well as Rocky Ramsey and her co-author Trisha Arend about their new book, The Nadine Ramsey Story. Blue skies.